Okay, First Timothy chapter 5. So we left off last time, and Paul was giving some instructions to Timothy, some personal instructions to Timothy in terms of his ministry and the overall purpose of it. And so he kind of expanded back out there in chapter 4 and just talking about the importance of Timothy and how Timothy was to maintain good conduct among the Ephesian brethren. And he really puts an emphasis on that's how Timothy's going to do it. It's not that Timothy is going to fact check everybody into godliness. It's not that Timothy is going to browbeat everyone into righteousness. It's how Timothy is conducting himself among the Ephesian brethren that tends to be of primary importance. That's what's going to show them, first of all, the care that we already know that Timothy has for the church, and it's going to show them the love that he has for them. That's how he's going to influence them and show them the correct way. Okay, so for instance, 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12, a verse that we know very well, but we tend to only focus on the first part of it. He says to Timothy, "No one should despise your youth. Instead, you should be an example to the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity." And so in all the problems that the Ephesian church is having, here are 5 key things that Paul mentions that Timothy needs to exemplify in order to show them how to do the same thing. Speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity. So, when Paul wrote earlier in the letter, I'm writing these things so that people will know how to act in God's household. Timothy is now to be the example of that. And then move down there to chapter 4 and verse 16. He reminds Timothy there, "Be conscientious about yourself and your teaching. Persevere in these things," all the things he just mentioned. "Be committed to them so that your progress may be evident to all." And so this is not about Timothy's progress in terms of their gauging him. His progress, again, becomes an example for them and how they should act. Now, again, one of the primary things that we know about Timothy from other letters that we have written about him, and I'm thinking primarily right now about the Philippian letter, Philippians chapter 2 and 3, where Paul talks about Timothy, and he mentions to the brethren in Philippi, "I have no one else who cares about you as much as Timothy does." Now, what's going to happen here in chapter 5 is Paul is going to give Timothy some instructions concerning various groups within the church and how the relationships and care for those groups is to be maintained and fostered. Okay, so really there's kind of 4 main groups here. The first group is basically different age groups. So it's kind of a more encompassing group. So he mentions in chapter 5 and verse 1, older men, older women, younger men, and younger women. So this is people of all ages and how they should be treated with respect. We're going to come back and talk about that in just 1 second. The second group he mentions and spends quite a bit of time on in chapter 5 is widows. And there's a couple of different subgroups within that particular specification. The third group that he will mention is he comes back to a discussion on elders. After having given the characteristics of elders and deacons, now he's going to talk about conduct with elders specifically, and how they are to be esteemed, and then even if there's conflict with the elders, how that is to be handled as well. And then the fourth group that he's going to talk about there, really at the beginning of chapter 6, is the relationship between slaves and masters. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, time permitting, this morning. So let's pick up chapter 5 and verse 1 with that first group, those people of all age groups. He says in verse 5, "Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and with all propriety, the younger women as sisters. All right, so there's really two action verbs that I see in this verse. The first one is do not rebuke. Now, I had this on a screen, but I had the word up there. This word rebuke is essentially a word that has a root that means to strike or to hit, basically. So we can kind of see how that takes place. We have the sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, right? Well, Paul says words can hurt. And so you need to be careful how you're using your language, especially when speaking with an older group of people, people who have age and wisdom and are worthy of respect. So do not rebuke, do not strike with words. However, the second verb there, but exhort him as a father. Okay, so if you're coming into conflict or you're just general everyday dealings with an older gentleman, an older man, you're to treat him as you would your own family member. Now, there's a familial relationship with fathers, but there's also a level of respect within the family. There's a hierarchy there, and the father is the head of the family. And so he says, when you are associating with older men here, exhort them as a father. And that word exhort basically has a meaning of to pull along beside. Okay? So basically you're wrapping an arm around this individual and bringing them beside you rather than just striking them with your words, okay? So do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father. And now he says, younger men as brothers. So the same thing, we could take the first part of that verse, do not rebuke a younger man, but exhort him as a brother. Older women as mothers, and with all propriety, the younger women as sisters. Now, I think it's important here that Paul is using this family language to refer to the church, because it would make sense to them that within their familial relationships, just as it was with us, as it would be with us, there's a closeness there, a tightness, something that you don't have anywhere else in the world. He says that's how it's supposed to be among you. Now, we've already seen within this book how we have people of different strata and divisions that are happening in the church because people are treating each other either with contempt or they are elevating themselves so that they can take prominence, but not so within this familial relationship. And so he says that's how you need to deal with each other. Okay, so that's the first group. And feel free to stop me at any time if you have any comments or questions about any of these. The second group he mentions, one that may take a little bit of our time this morning, is the support of widows. This is kind of a unique section within Paul's epistles because this is really, first of all, the amount of space in this letter that he spends on this. It may be, again, that there's some sort of situation in Ephesus where this is a prominent type of thing, where something is not being done. You kind of think about an Acts chapter 6 type scenario, right, where some widows are getting left out, or the widows as a whole are just being treated as second-class citizens or forgotten. Okay, but just kind of looking at this, within this section, he mentions 4 basically subcategories of widows. And so we're going to, instead of kind of just taking this all as it's written, we're going to break these out into their separate spots. Eddie.
And one thing that comes out before you start looking at subgroups is that very first verse, honor the widows.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason why, and the reason why he spends so much time is because widows traditionally in that culture had the least value of any human beings.
Yes.
To the culture, at least in their mindset.
Yes.
They could not support themselves in most cases. They had nothing that could be offered to society. And so I think Paul is kind of dealing with the cultural viewpoint that widows are just, as soon as we can get rid of them, the better.
Yeah.
And instead, the attitude among the disciples is they need to be honored and valued.
Exactly. And we see that as a consistent theme throughout Scripture, both Old and New Testament. Even as far back as Deuteronomy and the giving of the law, widows are to be remembered. It's talked about in the Psalms. And actually, when we get into the prophets, both major and minor, it's one of the things that Israel is indicted about. Israel and Judah are indicted about is that they are not taking care of orphans and widows. And then, of course, we think to the passage that we probably know very well, James 1:27. James mentions that true religion is associated with the care that we have for orphans and widows. And so to Eddie's point, why these groups and why this group in particular here, it's because these are the most vulnerable groups in this society. I think that's the key there. And it's a good thing to keep in mind as we do go through these various groups, because we are going to see some distinctions here where there are levels of support and there are methods of support that don't involve the church assembly. Okay, so let's get into those. So he says, verse 3, support widows who are genuinely widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they should learn to practice their religion toward their own family first and to repay their parents, for this pleases God. The real widow or genuine widow, left all alone, has put her hope in God and continues night and day in her petitions and prayers. However, she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command this so that they won't be blamed. Okay, let's stop there for just 1 second. Now, he uses this phrase. Mine says real widows. Yours might say genuine widows. Is there any other translation on that? Any other word that's used there? Widows indeed. Okay, yeah. So, is there any woman who has lost her husband that is not a widow? I mean, that seems like an odd question to ask, but it almost seems like he's like the true widows, not those who are like faking widowhood or something. So we have to figure out exactly what he's talking about here, Eddie.
I think this would be the ones who do have some sort of support structure in place.
Yes. So then there's a distinction there. So already we have to make a judgment, well, not judgment, but discernment. Use discernment in how these situations are to be handled. Now, I say this, let me kind of preface this discussion, because what Paul is going to say here, some of what he has to say might strike us as, wait a minute, that just makes total sense. Somebody's really getting after it out there. What Paul has to say, just it makes total sense, and it wouldn't make sense that we wouldn't just support everyone, because we live in a society that, for good or ill, there is a call for social justice. There's a call for social programs and those types of things, and we can have that discussion another time. But to say that any widows, especially as we've just had that discussion about, there are widows are among the most vulnerable in this society. To say that any of them should be left out of support from the church almost seems a little harsh to us, but Paul's going to tell us why. Okay, so he says, first of all, support widows who are, or honor widows who are genuinely widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they should learn to practice their religion toward their own family first and to repay their parents, for this pleases God. Okay, so we have, again, two classes here. These are two of our subcategories. First, we have a widow who is not able to take care of herself at all. She has no family for whatever reason. She has no children for whatever reason. She has no support structure. So there's kind of one subcategory there. Now, we also have another category of widows who do have family, and those families are to take care of her. They are to take her in and take care of her needs. So there's one instance there where he says, basically, the church should not be burdened with that because there are people who need to bear that responsibility. She does have a support structure. And he even terms it as repayment. Now, why do you think Paul would call this repayment? Like, is there some sort of like bank system here? Is there, she gave all her money for them, now they got to pay her back with interest? What's going on here? Why would he use the word repay? And that's really literally what the word means. How do you parse that out? Right. Yeah. And so she's not keeping receipts or anything, but we would not be here without our mothers. Like there is, we kind of talked about that in chapter 2 when we talked about the importance of women, even within this instruction. Man cannot complete his purpose without women. So we don't exist if there are no women. And then again, children primarily tend to gravitate towards mothers as they are raised and still within the household. So that repayment is just kind of the natural affection that we should have for our mothers. Okay, this is the point at which all mothers now take out their phones and tell their kids, text me, I need to know what's going on. I need, call me. I need to call my mom too. So, yes. This is a Christian Standard Bible. Yep. I know they do go a little bit more modern sometimes.
No, I was going to say the ESV actually turned.
Yes. Yes. And so the word there is actually the one that Jesus uses that says that all men will be repaid according to their deeds, and similar type things. So it literally does mean a repayment, a return. I don't want to say return on investment, but you know what I mean. Mothers do invest a lot in their kids. Okay, so he says, verse 5, then, going back to this first category, the real widow, left all alone, has put her hope in God and continues night and day in her petitions and prayers. All right, so here is a woman that this is one that doesn't have that support structure. However, she trusts in God. She is a woman that reminds me of a widow that we see in the Old Testament, the widow of Zarephath, right? When, is it Elijah or Elisha? I always get this confused. It's Elijah, correct? That comes to the widow of Zarephath? Somebody, I'm pretty sure it's Elijah. Either way, Elijah comes to her and he says, what have you got left? Give that to me and God will take care of you. And she trusts in faith that he is telling the truth. She trusts in faith that he is a true prophet. She trusts in faith that God will provide. And so this is that type of mentality. Okay, so here is a woman that really does love the Lord and trusts in his providence. And the way that he's going to provide for her is going to be outlined later in this chapter. Okay, so the real widow, left all alone, has put her hope in God, continues night and day in her petitions and prayers. However, verse 6 now, going back to the other category, she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. And so we kind of see two mentalities there. We have a widow that is concerned with the cares of God. We have a widow that has been concerned with the cares of those who are around her, and he's going to elaborate on that here in just a second. And then we have one, he refers to her as self-indulgent. Everything she does is centered around herself. That's what he's talking about. And he says, she is dead even while she lives. So verse 7, command this so that they won't be blamed. Now, verse 8, now if anyone, going back to the family support now, if anyone does not provide for his own relatives, and especially for his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So talking about these families that need to be providing for mothers, the widows, this is serious to God. Because it's not just that they are to be rebuked. He says they are like an unbeliever, or the literal word there is infidel, someone who has no fidelity. And they're to be treated like that because they have denied the faith. If we pair this with James 1:27, James says true religion is this, to take care of orphans and widows in their distress. If someone has denied that, they obviously have no connection to true religion. So verse 9 then, no widow should be placed, and again, yours might have a little bit different language. No widow should be placed on the official support list or enrolled unless she is at least 60 years old, has been the wife of one husband, and is well known for good works. That is, if she has brought up children, shown hospitality, washed the saints' feet, helped the afflicted, and devoted herself to every good work. So there's character implications in this as well. And did you notice as we were reading through those here, do some of those, or almost all of those characteristics, mirror something we've already seen? The elders, exactly. The characteristics of godly elders. So it's the same thing, only instead of saying a one-man woman, he calls her a one-woman man. So a woman that is faithful, hospitable, humble, generous, welcoming, that's the type of woman that needs to be. He uses the word enrolled or placed on a support list. Now, this section is going to seem very odd to us because of the society that we live in today. I'm not saying that there aren't widows or women who fall in this situation that don't have some sort of support structure. However, we do have things in our country like social welfare. We do have things in our country like you can get your spouse's Social Security and other types of things. Okay, so our country is set up in a way, and our kind of government and economic structure is set up in a way that means of support are generally provided. We also have, in our society, we also have women who work, who have occupations. And so they may have their own money stored up, their own 401ks and all those types of things. Because we, in our situation, we encourage investment, futures, all types of those types of things. They don't have that in this society. So this is the time and place that Paul is writing in. But the teaching is still applicable. Because if there was someone in this situation, we tend to think of this only in an American mindset, but what if we're talking about an African country? What if we're talking about an Asian country? This has to be applicable to all churches everywhere. A South American country, we have a woman who does not have some sort of backup plan in terms of a bankroll or 401k or anything like that. She needs to be supported. And so what I believe Paul is saying here, and I'm open to discussion on this, what I believe Paul is saying here is the church is well within its rights to support that woman in whatever way that it can. Is that any discussion or questions or comments on that, Mike?
But there are circumstances when they shouldn't support that woman. And I think that's the application you talk about how things are different now. A single woman can go out and get a job in 21st century America. But every culture, there's a way in which women are supported.
Yes.
Now, otherwise, it is selected for men.
Right.
So, and Paul, he said in verse 14, where he says he wants younger women to marry. Now, that doesn't necessarily jive with our modern thinking, but that's the way the young woman could find support by finding a man and attaching herself to that again. And he's saying younger widows ought to do that because the alternative would be, hey, we have a nice program for widows. I'm a 20-year-old widow woman. I can get on the dole and just live off the church for the next 60 years. Mm-hmm. And Paul said, no, we don't want to do that. So part of the application today would be, yes, but there are people who are needy in the church. The church needs to support them and not look for excuses not to support them. Yes. And the other application is, if you have a widow or a woman or a person, is there really a need, or are or they just avoiding feeling their need because they know someone else is gonna take care of them.
Yes, yes. And so there is, again, there's a level of discernment that we're supposed to practice here. Almost, I would almost term it a level of common sense, because the scenario that you provided, let's say a 20-year-old woman, unfortunately, her husband, who she's only been married to probably a short time, passes away. Could she then be enrolled in this and then receive support in perpetuity for potentially the next 60 years, or however long her life might last? So yeah, so he provides these stipulations. Bob. Well, I just mean if she's 20 and she lives until she's 80, that would be I just pulled. Well, no, you're correct. I was just using 60 as an arbitrary number for, right, yes,
Is saying there's a cutoff here.
right,
It can't just be any cutoff.
right, yeah. So lest we could think about the church being pharisaical and say, hey, if there's a 55-year-old woman who finds herself in need and doesn't have a family, the church should support her. Well, Paul says, no, but you should be taking care of one another. That concept can't be lost in this. Just because she's not officially supported or enrolled, whatever capacity that takes, doesn't mean that someone who is in need should not be taken care of in whatever strata or social group or gender that they find themselves within the assembly. We have to take care of one another. Eddie.
An interesting balance in this section, that it's very evenly balanced between positive statements about how you should be looking to support, and then also negative statements to limit where that support should be dependent upon.
Right.
And we have to be careful that we don't emphasize one side or the other.
Right.
I've heard people who emphasize all the negatives. These are the reasons why we shouldn't support widows, to win arguments back in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
But then I've also heard the opposite side of that people are saying, well, we need to just, we need to support everybody. We need to include everybody. And we actually do that harm when we do that. If we enable people to avoid their own responsibilities, and we harm them in doing so.
Mm-hmm.
So we really have to make sure that we are balancing the idea of both being inclusive, but also recognizing, let people do what they should be doing in God's.
Yes. We have to balance compassion with wisdom, right? I mean, that's what discernment is. It's balancing all things around us with wisdom. And so Paul is just giving some practical advice on that. And I mean, he is giving some specific stipulations there. And when you think them through, when you kind of hear what Paul is saying and see it for what it is in terms of the larger concept of caring for one another, showing respect for one another, it does make sense. So kind of continuing this thought then, verse 11, we've kind of already mentioned this, but refuse to enroll younger widows, for when they are drawn away from Christ by desire, they want to marry and will therefore receive condemnation because they have renounced their original pledge. And at the same time, they also learn to be idle, going from house to house. They're not only idle, but are also gossips and busybodies, saying things that they shouldn't. Verse 14, therefore I want younger women to marry, have children, manage their households, and give the adversary no opportunity to accuse us. For some have already turned away to follow Satan. Okay, let's stop there for just 1 second. Now we're kind of looking at Paul and saying, okay, you're kind of generalizing now, Paul, that you're saying basically all younger women, that if they are widowed and then remarry, that they're going to be, distracted and self-indulgent and all those types of things. I think what Paul is dealing with here is a situation that they have already seen in Ephesus and potentially are seeing currently. It doesn't mean that every younger widow is doing this, but it is a potential in this society. Again, this is a city with a lot of people, ideas, and money flowing through it. And so there is always the potential for distraction from any of these groups, but he's dealing with this group in particular. And so he says it's good for younger women to remarry and to raise families of their own. And then in the future, if unfortunately she is widowed again, she will have that family to support her. That's not the only reason she's having the family, but she will have that family as a support structure. Okay. Verse 16 then, he says, if any believing woman has widows, she should help them, and the church should not be burdened, so that it can genuinely help those, so that it can help those who are genuinely widows. And so again, I want to wrap this section up because I do want to get to elders with what time we have left this morning. We have to practice discernment and wisdom in how we carry this out. But we also need to think individually and as a group here about how we're supporting one another. Paul is only dealing here. He is not dealing with widows at large. He's not talking about, worldwide. What he's talking about in this whole section is within the church, within the assembly, and I would even say the assembly that you are a part of. And so if we are practicing compassion and wisdom and discernment and care for one another, this will happen. We will take care of one another. This is just an official, or, I hesitate. I don't know what the word there is, but this is an approved way that the church from its funds can support this vulnerable group. Brett.
Just going to make a point that this whole section, I'm reading from the ESV, it goes to honor widows who are truly widows.
Yes.
And then at the end of this section, in verse 16, it says that the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. So
Yes.
that brackets, this is what we're talking about.
Right.
Truly widows.
Yes. Yeah, and it almost seems like when he says genuinely widows, that it's not necessarily referring to any woman who has lost a husband. It's a woman who has lost a husband that has just no one else, nothing else. A woman of a certain age. Yeah, right. Yes. Okay, so again, keep these groups within the context of what Paul is writing to Timothy, to this church, and then we'll make application in our own assembly. All right, so verses 17 through the end of the chapter, he reverts back to a discussion on elders. Now, we just talked about kind of official enrollment or support of widows. He's going to mention something about elders here that seems like we can also pay elders in terms of put them on a support list as well. So verse 17, it's a similar vein. The elders who are good leaders should be considered worthy of an ample honorarium or given double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. Okay, so let's just kind of take that right there for what it is. So for one thing, elders, we've already said that in the characteristics of elders, that they are apt to teach where the need arises. And here he says that elders, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching, those who are genuinely caring enough about the flock, not just to stand back and take care of problems when they arise, but are actively feeding the flock, they are worthy of double honor or an honorarium. Now, you could take that in kind of two ways, and I don't think those two ways are mutually exclusive of one another. The first way you could take it is kind of on a literal level. You could take it as they are just worthy of honor or respect. And I certainly think that that's the case. In my view of elders that I have crossed paths with in the past, they have a love for the church that is borne out in the work that they do. There's stuff that we don't even know that comes to them, that they deal with, that they're burdened with that. And so they're worthy of the respect that deserves. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is he uses the word honorarium, or double honor, which does seem to imply a payment, a literal payment of those elders. And he says they are worthy of it. They're considered worthy of it. Now, again, the society that we live in, generally in the churches, many elders already have a secular job or another means of support. If they are older men, they may already be retired from their jobs and have some sort of investment account that they've been storing up for years and years. So we don't generally see elders being paid much in these days, but it is something that we can do. Now, you look again back at an Acts chapter 6 situation. The apostles had to prioritize the work that they were able to do. And they trusted that as they did that work, they would be supported by those that they were preaching to, and that others would take over some of the other responsibilities that needed doing. And elders, somewhat similar in that he is so invested in this work that it may be that he does need supported financially. And that is something that Paul seems to say that the church is able to do. So he said, verse 18, for scripture says you must not muzzle an ox that is threshing grain, and a laborer is worthy of his wages. Now he's going to kind of move on from this, kind of keep that double honor in the first sense of that double honor, in the sense of paying esteem and respect as we go through this next section. Verse 19, don't accept an accusation against an elder unless it is supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. Publicly rebuke those elders who sin, so that the rest will also be afraid. Okay, and so he's also going to say, verse 22, don't be too quick to lay hands on anyone, and don't share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. Okay, so in terms of elders, keep in mind as we're thinking about this section, because it seems like what we're dealing with here is the discipline of elders. Does that make sense? Is that kind of what we think we're dealing with, essentially? Are elders sinless people by virtue of their eldership? No, they're not. We're all humans. We said when we covered chapter 3, we have to give elders some room to be human. They are not perfect people. Doesn't mean we condone it, but it does mean that when an elder may stray, or an elder may do something that's not in line with the gospel message or the doctrine that the apostles have preached, that there does need to be a correction. And that's a tricky situation because we've got to figure out how to handle that. I mean, it's kind of difficult for me to think, just aside from the fact that I don't like conflict in the first place. But it's kind of difficult for me to think that I could go to Dempsey and say, Dempsey, you got some things you need to work on here. You got some, but he's saying there is a case for that. But how you do it is the important thing. First of all, he says, don't accept an accusation. So we're dealing pretty much here with a specific type of situation. Someone has brought an accusation against an elder. Any type of situation. I'm sure they happen then, they happen today, those types of things. And he says, except with 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, I know this is going to go into a discussion in just a minute about how many witnesses are needed to level an accusation against an elder. We might not have time for that right now. We may need to pick that up next week. But this concept of 2 or 3 witnesses, first of all, where does it originally come from? The concept of having 2 or 3 witnesses to accuse comes from the law of Moses, right? So that there were not frivolous lawsuits, and so that there were generally witnesses to whatever wrong, so that one person couldn't falsely accuse another. Who picked that up and talked about that again in the New Testament prominently? Jesus did, yes. That by the support of 2 or 3 witnesses, someone should also. So this is a concept that Jesus advocated heavily in how we treat one another and how we rebuke or exhort one another. Okay, so here is a situation where an elder is guilty of some sort of wrongdoing or error. And he says, verse 20, publicly rebuke those who sin. Right now, I would argue that this is the other side of the coin to the double honorarium comment or the double honor comment. Because elders are people, they don't put themselves out there saying, look at me, but by their lifestyle, you can see publicly how they live their lives. And in how they care for the church, we can see how that's taking place. So when an elder is in error, either in carrying out those duties or whatever that entails, that also has to be public. We need to know because it affects the entire church. So it's not that we're airing dirty laundry. That's not what this is about. This is about someone who is a leader or shepherd of the church, bringing them back to God so that we can all be shepherded and this relationship and structure works the way that it's supposed to. So publicly rebuke those who sin. Now the word rebuke there, I want to be clear, is not the same word that he used in chapter 5 and verse 1, where he says, don't rebuke an older man. This is not the word that means to strike or to hit. This is a word that does mean to call to account. Okay, to call someone to account. So publicly call an elder to account when they sin so that the rest will be afraid, so that everyone knows this is not acceptable behavior or this is not an acceptable practice. And I solemnly charge you before God and Christ Jesus and the elect angels to observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing out of favoritism. Just because you might like this individual does not mean you shouldn't carry this action out. As a matter of fact, it's the reverse. Because you care for them, because you love them, this has to be done in the way that Paul recommends it here. Okay, was that the first or the second bell? That's the second bell? Okay, so we'll wrap up there this morning. We will pick up here next week and then go into slaves and masters in chapter 6. Thank you so much for your comments this morning.